Hello, ladies and gents, boys and girls, people of all ages, sexualities, and identities, and welcome back to another book review. And today's book review is Anasi the Spider, a West African god. So, a little bit of pretext to this. One day, Anansi is visiting the king. He tells the king that he can ride Tiger. I can ride Tiger as if he were a horse. The king bursts out laughing, but Anansi is sure it will work. Anansi is a special spider. He is very small, still, he beats all his opponents. Anansi's stories were told by slaves in the Caribbean environment. The slaves had a hard life, but they found comfort in the stories about Anansi, the little hero who always wins from the strongest ones. So, what is Anansi the spider god all about, essentially? Well, it's about a god who is sort of more of a trickster. Now, here I'm going to list off very quickly a couple of the stories in this book for anyone who decides they want to get round and read this. How Anansi became clever. Anansi and the tiger. Anansi and the elephant. Anansi and the turtle. Anansi and the nightmare. Anansi and a clever way of borrowing money. Anansi and an even cleverer way of borrowing money. Anansi and the fish. Anansi and the funeral. So what makes Anansi clever, you may be asking? Well, Anansi is very clever because he uses wordplay and a lot of situations to get himself around things. Now, the first story I'm going to tell you about is Anansi and the tiger. So, as I previously mentioned at the beginning of this video, Anansi tells the king that he is going to ride a tiger. And so the king doesn't believe him, and of course, as it said on the back of the book, the king laughs at him. And he says, there's no way you're going to ride a tiger. However, Anansi is very clever, because what he does is he plays off of the sympathy of his friend Tiger. Anansi walks over to his friend's house and essentially plays at being ill and sick. And so Tiger, of course, mentions that he could take him to the village doctor. What Tiger doesn't realize is what Anansi's going to do next. So what Anansi does is Anansi basically climbs on top of Tiger, ready to go to the doctor, and full well knowing that the doctor's house is on the way to the king's palace, Anansi gets on the back of Tiger and decides to wave up at the king and pretty much jest himself around, making a point to Tiger that actually he doesn't need to go to the doctor, he just done this to win a bet. After he explains this to Tiger, Tiger feels used and most, of course, doesn't trust Anansi after that point. Now, another story of Anansi's I'm going to tell you from this book is Anansi asks a bunch of people for money. Then his friend passes away, who is an elephant, and he decides to go in the elephant's skin to pretty much make everyone feel bad for saying they were going to kill Anansi after they lent him money. What happens in the beginning of this story is they all joke about with Anansi that if he doesn't pay them back, they will murder him. So to make them feel bad, he turns up as elephant, pretends that he's died, and pretty much makes them all feel really guilty about the way they treated him. Another story, Anansi and the Nightmare, is a really interesting one. Now, anyone who knows the rough history based around this Ghanaian tale knows that Anansi is all to do with the slave trade, and I feel like one of the most interesting thing about the way that it's told in this book, especially to kids or whoever decides to read it, is the fact that Anansi describes his nightmare as kind of an really weird but really superstitious sort of ghost sort of nightmare, because he wakes up on a ship and he finds himself being beaten and trying to row through the seas. And then when he wakes up again, he suddenly realizes that his missus is actually calling him to wake up. When he tells his missus the story of the nightmare, she kind of just laughs it off and thinks that Anansi's gone crazy and is just telling another one of his fables. But what she doesn't realise is the actual reality that Anansi, the spider god, suddenly feels mortal, for a sense. And he finds himself in this position of where he starts to think to himself, oh dear, I could have been one of them. Now, the reason I find this very, very relevant to this story and to slavery in general is the idea that Anansi talking about slavery in this book isn't only talking about it from a point of view of someone having a nightmare, but also the reality of the fact that Anansi describes in the story that he believed in the dream that his wife was the one charting him across the sea. Now, of course, this wouldn't be too far-fetched in the sense that a lot of people's families, friends, and such on had charted them off for money through slavery. Now, the final story I'm going to tell you about, because I don't want to tell you too many of the stories in this book, is Anansi and the funeral. Now, Anansi takes 3 friends with him to separate funerals. The first is an antelope, the second is a dog, and the last is a rabbit. And Anansi tells each and every one of them that if they go to the funeral and cry, they can have anything they want to eat. They will be asked by someone to eat something. So Antelope decides that he wants hot peppers. And so Anansi chooses the lamb soup. But then Antelope feels cheated, but the next time Dog goes with him. Dog does the same. However, by the final person, Rabbit chooses the lamb soup. Rabbit listened more to Anansi in this final story in a kind of way, because even though Anansi was tricking the last 2, he wasn't doing it intentionally. He was more to the point, making them see what was going on. And most importantly, he was trying to get them to listen to what he was trying to say, that if they went to the funeral and they cried, they would be asked if they were hungry and what they wanted to eat. He didn't say they had to choose the hot peppers. He just said that you can get hot peppers so you can cry. So, Anansi the spider, a West African god. What did I think of this book overall? It's a really interesting book, and as I mentioned before, it really, really highlights a lot of issues and a lot of ways that things happen. I like that we get this kind of sense that Anansi in some parts of the book feels mortal, and other parts of the book he feels superstitious. The superstitious side being the fact that he is living somewhere where he is most probably not surrounded by a lot of people. The mortal part is the way that he's described being beaten in the village, the way that he's being described as being treated like a slave. I feel like that's the very core purpose in this whole story, about describing him not maybe so much as a immortal, but more as a mortal being that, yes, has the powers behind what they can do, but it's all about trickery more than necessarily them trying to cheat people out of things. Another story I'm going to quickly bring up, because I feel like it was an interesting one, is there's one about Anansi not wanting to work, and Anansi basically getting someone else to do all the work on the river. I thought this was a really interesting story because Anansi doesn't take the fish, he tries to sell people rotten nets. And this comes into what I was just bringing up about the beaten bit. Anansi gets beaten in this story, out of all these little short stories, in which he gets beaten because he tries to sell rotten nets at the market whilst his friend keeps selling fish. Now, the only thing that no one else in the village seems to understand is that the fish would never have been caught if the rotten nets hadn't been used. And Anansi at the end of the story pretty much gets to this point where he doesn't understand why his friend didn't take the pain for him. Now his friend thinks that he's lazy and he's just trying to take the mick, but in a way Anansi had a kind of point in his story, is at the end of the day they both did the fishing, so why is one of them getting punished and not the other? So Anansi the Spider God. What would I give it out of 10? Honestly, a solid 10 out of 10. It's a really interesting story. It's got some really good moral points, and most importantly, I love the way that it flows and the way that it gives you time to kind of think about where the story's going and what's happening, what the outcome will be. And for that reason, that's why I give it a solid 10 out of 10. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next book review. Till then, goodbye. Stay beautiful, you beautiful people.